Hey, this is Randy, the Swiss Frog Guy, and in this video, I'm going to go over how I made the stand that goes underneath my terrarium.
And this time, I'm taking on a challenge. You see, many years ago, I was inspired by the king of DIY to make my very first ultra-strong terrarium stand. That led to Willie's very first stand, which worked great for several years. But little did Willie know, she was just about to get a brand new, giant 4,500-liter house I was building. So my challenge was, could I use the same basic concept and scale it up so it wasn't just 1, 2, or 3 times, but 4 times as big? And not only that, could I improve on it so it wasn't just functional, but it was a nice piece of furniture that could be moved anywhere in the house. I'll be sharing the process, the tools, and materials I'm using, including the mistakes I made along the way. So let's get straight into the build. As usual, I turned to CAD designing first. This way I could work through a lot of the details before wasting any material. It also helped me plan around other parts of the terrarium I was working on, like the giant foam tree I talked about in another video series. I really like to use Tinkercad because it's free, it's online, and there's a community that shares ideas and designs. I'll put a link in the description. The whole key to this super strong design is the main vertical supports which carry the weight of the terrarium, and then 2 horizontal frames, one at the bottom and another one fixed at the top, ensure that the vertical supports remain perfectly straight. Doubling the vertical supports makes sure the weight of the terrarium is distributed evenly all over to the horizontal frames. No weight is placed on screws anywhere, so it's super strong. And to this basic design, I added in lots of extras like wheels, support for the pond, shelves, electricity, lighting, just as important, a nice covering so it would not only be functional, but would also look good. I built my terrarium stand exactly to measure according to my terrarium design, and I chose my final dimensions based on what I could fit in my house under the ceiling, and what I could literally fit out the window. Once I finished my CAD design, I then color-coded all the pieces I would need. This helped me plan exactly how many pieces of lumber to get and precisely how to cut them. This way, I was able to use almost every piece of wood that I bought. As far as construction materials, you can use pretty much any kind of wood you want. I decided to use 40 by 80mm glued laminated timber. It's a bit more expensive than cheap normal wood, but it's far stronger and straighter and doesn't crack. And even though I could cut them myself, I asked the store where I got them to cut everything perfectly to size, and this way everything would match exactly. I first did a dry run to ensure all the pieces fit, and it was a good idea I did because unfortunately the store cut some of the pieces incorrectly and I had to buy another piece and cut them by hand. And at that point, I decided it was time to quit planning and start building for real. I had to work quickly because the rest of the terrarium was coming soon. With all the pieces cut, I pre-drilled holes for the screws. This is really important because it not only holds the pieces firm when you put them together, but it reduces the chances the wood could split. And I found masking tape to be super helpful to keep things from slipping while I was drilling. For this entire assembly, I used 4.5 by 80mm wood screws. It took about 150 just to put the basic stand together, so I was really happy I had an electric screwdriver. This stand was going to be the basis for all the rest of my terrarium, so it was super critical to make it as absolutely square as possible, because any errors at this point would only be magnified in the final build. And with hundreds of kilos and glass involved, a sloppy build can be very dangerous. With the first frame complete, I assembled the second frame using the exact same method. I double-checked the 2 frames for squareness and then screwed in place the first vertical supports that would give the stand all its strength. Next came the inner vertical supports that distribute the weight of the stand over the frame. I then set the top frame in place and screwed everything together. And to reduce the chance of cracking, I always put the screws at diagonals wherever I could. It was getting really close, and the only thing left was to add some wheels on the bottom so I could move it and access features from the back. As I explain later in this video, these 6 wheels work great at first, but they turned out to be way underrated for the weight of the terrarium. I explain a little bit more about that later, but for now, the stand was basically done. Time elapsed, 4 hours, 51 minutes. One of the main goals from the beginning of this project was always to have a big pond where Willie could swim. The pond I ordered from the UK was about 60 liters, so it definitely needed support for its weight. The pond is only semi-rigid, so the easiest way to do this would be to just make a shelf underneath. And of course, this support would also provide a convenient storage shelf inside the stand. And by sinking the pond into the stand, Willie could have a deep pool. And of course, because I planned everything ahead of time with Tinkercad, I had all the pieces ready to go. I assembled this shelf on the floor in the same way that I made the basic stand itself. And then, using the pond as a guide, I mounted the shelf in the stand, leveled it carefully, and screwed it all into place. A perfect fit. I designed the shelf really carefully to not just support the weight of the pond securely, but also to provide a perfect space to hide the filter and humidity control systems. After all, a major goal of this build was to have a final clean look with all control systems hidden away from view. With the main frame finished, I could now install the floors and the rest of the shelves. I decided on 10mm oriented strand board, or OSB. OSB is made of wood chips, so it's stronger than normal plywood, warps less, and is resistant to water. Plus, it's much cheaper. So I measured everything out and got to cutting.
Gotta cut this pattern out of...
There were a lot of little corners to cut out, so a jigsaw was perfect to make these little adjustments. This kind of saw is much safer to use than a skill saw. It's easy to handle and it works great for smaller cuts. Another perfect fit. And now it was just a question of screwing all the pieces together. And since the screws I used for the floor were pretty small, I didn't need to pre-drill the holes at all. I had removed the pool support temporarily to make it easier to work, but now, with the floor in place, I could remount it, ensure it was level, and install its shelf. I knew I wanted plenty of storage space in the stand underneath the terrarium, so I also planned a shelf opposite the pond. But for this shelf, I chose 19mm white melamine, or medium density fiberboard. It wouldn't be exposed to water damage, and it looked nicer. Plus, it allowed me to finish the edges.
Just got this 19mm. So what do we have here? Okay, now let's cut it.
Back to the jigsaw. Before I mounted the shelf in place, I added edging tape to the sides. This tape is cheap, easy to apply, and it gives a really nice edge. It's really easy to use. You just cut the lengths you want, tape them in place, then use a hot iron to stick them down. A light pass with fine sandpaper is great to smooth any rough edges, and a few dabs of white acrylic paint covers any little cracks. Just follow it up with a quick wipe with a moist rag. And once the edging was done, I could mount the shelf into position, ensure it was level, and then screw it all into place. I don't really have my own workshop, so I had to build my terrarium right in the middle of my house, but the stand became really useful because it became its own rolling workshop. Everything I needed was always right there at my fingertips, ready to use. And when I wanted to clean things up at the end of the day, I could just put it right back in the stand. I wanted my stand to be clean without cables everywhere, so I planned it to have plenty of internal outlets. This way I could plug in lights, automated controls, and still give room to grow. By using outlets, I could change any device anytime easily without having to rewire things. And by mounting the outlets on a vertical panel, I reduced the chance of a short circuit just in case any water dripped from above. I can't overemphasize how important it is to have plenty of places to plug in things into the stand. Cableitis is always a pain with terrariums, and now was a chance to get rid of it once and for all. At this point, my stand was basically fully functional. It was strong, it could roll, and it was wired for power. But the bottom line, it was, for lack of a better word, pretty ugly. It was time to change that. major goal for my terrarium was not just to make something that was functional, but also something that looked nice. After all, at 2.5 by 1.5 by 1 meter, this thing was going to take up a lot of my house. After a bunch of research, I decided on melamine. It's not all that strong and it's susceptible to water damage, but it's easy to work with, kind of matches IKEA furniture, and it's pretty inexpensive. I looked into PVC foam sheeting, but I wanted something heavier for the doors. Using my CAD design as a guide, I had all my pieces cut to measure, and then I made minor adjustments to each piece as needed. This way, I paid for only what I used. I used different thicknesses depending on whether strength or weight was a higher priority. Starting at the front, I mounted the veneers by screwing from the inside of the frame. This way I avoided any screws on the outside. For the doors in front, I decided to make them sliding so they could be easily removed if needed. Since the melamine doors were only 5 millimeters thick, they were pretty light, so I just used some aluminum profile as a guide track. 2 pieces of U-channel side by side worked great. A little knob on each door gave it a finished look and made it easy to open. To cover the right side of the stand, I mounted a piece of 19mm melamine, again by screwing from the inside. And even though you wouldn't see it, I wanted to keep the back closed to keep dust down on the inside. Just had to make some holes so I could pass electricity and climate control. I used thumb screws so I could open the back whenever I wanted later. On the frame side, I installed T-nuts into the wood to give somewhere to screw in. These tended to pop out, so next time I think I'd use some threaded wood insert nuts. But so far so good. 3 out of 4 sides covered. Now it was time to take a look on the inside. With a stand this big, it's important to be able to see inside so you can access things like filters and foggers. I didn't really want to deal with switches that I have to turn off, so I installed 3 rechargeable 5-volt LED cabinet lights. A cool thing about these lights is they're motion sensitive, so they turn on automatically when you open the cabinet and turn off automatically. And when there's enough light, they don't even turn on. They're pretty bright and they stay charged for months. Lighting problem solved. I had only one more side to cover on my stand, but I put off the most complicated one to the very last. The last piece of covering I needed to deal with was the service door. Originally, I planned to be able to remove the side panel completely. My idea was that I could use some ultra-strong magnets to allow snapping the sides on and off. This way, I could access the pond, the filter, and any other equipment easily from below. Seemed cool and futuristic, but the problem was, it just didn't work. After trying a lot of approaches, the magnets just weren't strong enough to hold the weight. It wasn't so easy letting go of my cool magnet idea, but sometimes the best solution is the simplest. I had to admit, I just needed to make a normal door. And the easiest way was to make it with a concealed hinge. These have 2 parts. One's mounted on the frame and the other part goes on the door. This way everything's hidden on the inside, hence the name concealed hinge. Installing a concealed hinge isn't complicated, but it does need to be done carefully. The first step is to drill cups into the doors to fit the hinges. To know exactly where to put the holes, I used this handy jig that came with the set. In my case, the cups needed to be exactly 35 millimeters diameter and flat on the bottom. And to do that, I used this special Forstner drill bit. Normally, these kind of drill bits are used with a big drill press because they tend to wander around and make wobbly holes. But I didn't really have a drill press. So instead, I made a custom jig to keep the drill bit stable. I just drilled a hole in a piece of wood that exactly matched the drill bit. Then I clamped it in place and drilled through the hole. This way, the drill bit couldn't wander and the cups were perfectly straight. A perfect fit. And now the only thing left to do was to pre-drill the screw holes so the melamine didn't split. And pushing a piece of wood behind the hinges as you screw them in makes sure they're totally straight.
Now we just gotta go hang the door.
Once I had the hinge cups drilled, I covered the edges of the doors with edging tape, then sanded everything smooth. I had already installed the mounting brackets in the stand, so the only thing that was left was to put in the cups and finally hang the door. A narrow strip of melamine on the left completed the look, and the door was done. Quick check of the lights. Just as planned, they come on fully automatically, and though you can't see it here, when you close the door, after a few seconds, the lights turn off automatically as well. So, we're done. Not really. A lot of times when we watch a how-to video, it seems like it's all as easy as 1, 2, 3. But the reality is, we often omit the little steps that didn't work. It's not about being dishonest. It's just that if we were to include every decision, every test, everything, it would kind of make the whole point of making a how-to video kind of pointless. After all, hopefully we've learned something along the way. But sometimes seeing what doesn't work well is just as helpful as seeing what does. That's why I wanted to explain a bit more about the casters on this stand. I already explained how I added casters to the stand to make it easy to move as I was building. To distribute the weight evenly, I put one caster under each vertical support. This made a total of 6 casters. Initially, I was super happy because it moved easily in all directions. But as I continued my build, a problem suddenly appeared. The casters I chose literally collapsed under the weight of the terrarium. I double-checked and they were rated for 180 kilograms. So what was going on? That's when I realized that the 180 kilograms was for the entire set of 4, so each wheel could actually support only 45 kilograms. Even with 6 casters, the maximum weight would be 270 kilograms. At first this was no big deal because the stand only weighed about 115. But as I continued my build, the weight increased rapidly. By the end of the project, my build was topping out at a massive 400 kilograms. That's 850 pounds. And on top of that, sometimes the quality control from AliExpress isn't so great, so maybe the wheels weren't even rated correctly in the first place. Whatever the case, there was no doubt I needed to replace the wheels, but how? It was easy enough putting the wheels on when the frame was upside down, but with the thing weighing over 200 kilograms, this would be tough. With a little teamwork, almost anything's possible. I might not be able to pick up the entire stand and turn it upside down, but I could lift one side just enough so that someone could quickly slide a block of wood underneath. It was super tedious and nerve-wracking, but we just repeated it step by step until I could access the wheels. And speaking of wheels...
Hey, there's someone at the door. Look at that. Now that's a wheel. I think each one of these is rated for about 180 kilos. Let's make this thing work.
I needed to drill holes for the new wheel bolts, but even up on blocks, the space was still too tight to fit a drill. So instead, I got a bit that would fit into my handheld electric screwdriver, and it worked great. Since my new wheels were super heavy duty, I decided to use only 4 this time, 1 in each corner. Just looking at the weight, 4 of these could support over half a ton, which was more than enough. Besides, a well-meaning advisor suggested that using 6 wheels risked creating an imbalance. The idea was that with 6, you could risk teeter-tottering, put extra stress on a pair of wheels, and lead to breakage. So 4 wheels it was, and with a ratchet, I was able to attach them securely. And it all made perfect sense. Until I did it. Under the full weight of the terrarium, it ended up bowing severely in the middle. At first, I hadn't even noticed it because the terrarium was so long, but when I measured it, it was almost a centimeter. If you were to trace the arc out into a circle and compare it to, say, something the size of the Statue of Liberty, it wouldn't look like so much. But still, with so much glass involved, this was very dangerous. There was even a risk the terrarium could split in half. What I just didn't consider was that a structure as big as my terrarium isn't totally rigid. And even though things might look perfectly straight in a CAD design, it's easy to overlook things in your design, like this Tacoma bridge when they didn't think about oscillating wind, or me when I forgot that wood is flexible. As an emergency measure, I immediately removed the inside flooring and jammed pieces of wood under the middle of the terrarium just to prevent it from bowing more. I needed to get more wheels under this thing, and quickly. The problem was, the whole terrarium now weighed close to 400 kilograms. That's almost 900 pounds. There was absolutely no chance of lifting the terrarium like we did before, and the space underneath it was just too small to fit something like a car jack. After some intense and rather nerve-wracking Googling, I found enough inspiration to come up with a solution, and that was to build my own custom jack. And it wasn't very complicated. I just used a super heavy-duty bolt and a long nut that was like a sleeve, and by turning the sleeve slowly with a wrench, I could raise the terrarium. I stuck a little piece of metal just above and below the jack to protect the floor and the terrarium. It was a bit rickety and not exactly as stable as I wanted it to be, but with a bit of effort, I was able to lift up the terrarium high enough that I could get the wheels underneath and get things changed. In the end, the terrarium is now completely stable, it doesn't rock, and it doesn't sag. But there was an important lesson to learn in all this. No matter how carefully we make our designs and our plans, there's always the possibility that there's something we didn't think about that could really change things. Being ready for the unexpected and being prepared enough that we can adapt to it as it comes, that's what it's all about. Thanks a lot, you guys, for sticking with me through this really long video, and I hope to see you for the next ones. Got tons more content on its way. I'm working on the editing as fast as I can. In the meantime, this page is showing you some videos that you might want to check out. I don't know what it's showing you, but it's probably related to something on my channel. Till then, remember to like, share, and ring that bell. Bye!